Welcome once again to the third episode of Do You Know About Concentration Camps? So in the first two episodes, we learned that concentration camps were not restricted to South Africa alone, and that there were not only white camps, but that there were also black camps. So in this episode, I've got my very knowledgeable guest, Professor Fransjohanpretorius. Welcome again. And today we're going to talk about the black concentration camps. I assume that the fact that also black people were put in these concentration camps, in the so-called Boer camps, that led maybe to the renaming of the name of this war, where people didn't say it was not only a Boer war, but also other South Africans' war. Is that a correct assumption?
You know, we have a problem with the name of this war because none of them really fits in the picture. If we say Anglo-Boer War, it basically means the British or the English, who were dominant in the four home unions, against the Boers, which makes sense because they were the ones who had this political, diplomatic issue with an ultimatum and a formal war starting and being conducted. So that makes sense. But then you realize that black people were also affected and were involved in this war, which makes it a South African war. The only problem with that is that most historians agree that the British and the British imperialism were the main reasons for this war. So South African war doesn't tell us that the British were involved here. Okay. And the people in Vietnam don't call it the Vietnam War. I have asked, and they say it's the American War of Aggression. So we have different names for wars. What are we supposed to call this war? My opinion is that whether you say Anglo-Boer War or South African War, just know and illustrate that you are aware that who were the real ones formally in this war, the British and the Boers. And then secondly, because there were also Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians and colonials from the Cape and Natal, that you know that these people were involved if you say Anglo-Boer War. And if you say South African War, you know, with a little bit of discomfort, Britain was here somewhere.
Okay, that gives me some interesting things to think about. Thank you for that. Now let's talk about the black concentration camps. Where were they? Why were they there? How many people were in those camps? Just tell us about the black camps, please.
You know, one historian aptly said that they were black pawns in a white man's game, which meant that they were just there and this war happened around them. A little black village would sit there, and all of a sudden they would hear clippity, 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 and there would come a Boer commander over the hill, would take their mealies, their maize, and be off. And just when they're off, here comes the British along, clippity, clippity, clip, and take the rest of the mealies and perhaps their sheep. So they were pawns in this white man's game. They were affected by the war in the first place because they were also in the operational area. But then they also participated in this war on both sides. On the Boer side, not as armed combatants. There were there were very few exceptions of black men taking up arms during a battle. I can mention a few later if that's necessary. But what they did in the Boer forces was they were called achterrijers, after riders, henchmen, men who were to assist the Boers with cooking, with cleaning the rifles if necessary, and with looking for food, etc., grooming the horses. Normally, such a man, a achterrijer, black achterrijer, or a brown achterrijer, would be somebody who comes from the farm where the father and his 5 sons departed from. They take one of their laborers as their achterrijer or achterrijer. So the achterrijers were part of that. And there were a few achterrijers also in prisoner of war camps on St. Helena, for instance. But anyway, on the British side, there were two reasons for the British Army to accommodate. There were about 14,000 black transport drivers who drove their wagons with the supplies. And then, as the war progressed, the British under Lord Kitchener started to arm these black soldiers within their ranks. There were two reasons for that. The British Army was running out of men in Britain, and they had to get some supplies to line the blockhouse lines, to be guards in the blockhouses, which were being erected from about February 1901, all along the railway lines and rivers and so. So they had to get people guarding those blockhouse lines together with white guards. And the other reason was that the Boers were experiencing that black people were acting as guides or spies for the British. And they started to, without or with trial, execute these black people. So Kitchener decided, I'm going to arm these guys. This is a good reason for arming these guys. And by the end of the war, there were about 30,000 armed blacks in the British Army. Now, if you say there were altogether about 450,000 in total in the war, not together, British in the war, plus 30,000 armed blacks. 30,000 armed blacks is 50% more, almost, than the bitter Ender Boers, because there were 22,000 by the end of the war, Boers by the end of the war. It's startling to you if you start looking at these figures. That's the one thing. And then, of course, that's they were so involved in this war because they were hoping on a British victory, which would relieve them of the South African white domination. Obviously, they were naive in thinking that, because after the war, in the mines, for instance, their salaries were lower than before the war.
Sure. Okay. This is quite shattering. I mean, I didn't realize all these figures. I didn't know these figures. So, and then why were they taken into the concentration camps?
Well, the old thing, try and get them away from the operational area, because the British were experiencing that the Boers were either taking food from these people or they were given food by some of these local people. Remember that in a black group, we used to use the word tribe. In a black clan, there were cousins who wanted to be the chief. So they were against the main man. And if the chief was pro-British, somebody else would be pro-Boer to try and oust the chief. So yes, there were a few groups that were pro-Boer. And I can think of one or two at this moment. But so yes, to take them away from the field so that they could not provide the Boers with food. But then secondly, very important, once they were in these camps, they could be used, the men could be used as laborers in the gold mines on the Witwatersrand, which were started again in April 1901. And these black men were put on contract for 3 months away from their families in the concentration camps, and then sent to the mines, and then come back and another group would go. This, of course, gave them some income, but at least you the British now had the black people also under their skin. Initially, the administration was very bad, but from June 1901, there was a native refugee administration specifically for the black concentration camps.
So would you say that these were more refugee camps, or were they also as horrible as the concentration camps of the white people?
Yes, well, they were, many of them, most of them, were against their will, apparently. Some of them did arrive to be housed there, and that is that. So they were there for refugees, but they were in effect concentration camps because they could not escape. They were not supposed to go away, and so concentration camps for them. Get them out of the field, get rid of them, put them aside so that they don't take part in this war.
So, in other words, when we look at the white concentration camps and numbers and the black concentration camp and numbers, could you just compare the two?
There were about 115,000, 120,000 black people in these camps as well. In other words, the same number as in the white camps. And what is tragic is that we don't know how many of them died, because whereas the white camp administration was relatively good, the British were always good at administration. In the black camps, before June 1901, with the native refugee administration, they were not really administered well. So we don't know exactly how many of them died. Stel Kessler has reckoned, has calculated that at least 20,000, and perhaps as many as in the white camps. We will never know, because many of those little camps cannot be found now. There are a few of these camps have been through historical archaeology, have been found, and then you see these little molds, these little graves, but lost in oblivion.
Wow. Well, this was the last of our three-part episode, but I would like you to, right at the end, to give me your view of the effect that these concentration camps have had on us as a nation.
With the centenary in 1999 to 2002, there was this idea of, let us tell black people that white and black people suffered together in this war, which is perhaps a bit ideological. But if I go to the white experience of the concentration camps, this was revived in the 1930s in the high light of Afrikaner nationalism. The centenary of the Great Trek in 1938, the concentration camps was very much part of a revival of Afrikaner nationalism. And this kept on going with publications, with titles like Lest We Forget, Mag Ons Vergeet, or Hellkampe, Hell Camps, titles like that with books. And then from the 1960s, 70s, when Afrikaner nationalism subsided because they had achieved their republic, there was less of that. And then came three things. The 1994 new South Africa, the democracy. Afrikaners were not in control any longer. They were looking back at their history. And then also came the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where they got slack. Their apartheid atrocities were now there for them and all to see, and they felt bad about that. But they started saying, yes, but we had the same problem. We were also dominated, and we also suffered from another force. And then came the centenary in 1999 to 2002. And there was a renewal of interest in the concentration camps. But what I appreciate is that a lot of this is now much more sober. You will get historians who will try and give you a balanced picture of this. There's always the yes, but. What could the British do otherwise than put these people in camps because they were assisting the Boers while they were fighting? So there are other views on this now, and what is useful is that we read books like P.G. du Plessis' Feest van die Ongenooides, which was also a television in English, Feast of the Uninvited, where you realize things were not as easy or as simple as we think they were. People were for and against in one family. That is, I think, the main issue, that we look with more objectivity at the white concentration camps. The black camps is a very sad story, because we don't have any written diary or memoirs of black experience in the concentration camps. There was only one diary written. That was during the siege of Mafeking, and not in a concentration camp by a black person. That was Sol Plaatje, by the way.
Yes.
So, whereas in black memory, there's always oral tradition. That oral tradition is still there, but it's much weaker with the urbanization of black people in the 20th century. And therefore, the concentration camps as a factor is not so strong, particularly as it lasted for 2 years in comparison with white domination for 350 years. So that is what is in their oral tradition.
Well, I'm blown away, and I'm so grateful, and I am much the wiser. Thank you so much, Professor, for these 3 very enlightening episodes on the concentration camps. Thank you for joining us. I really, really appreciate that.
Thank you, on a sad note.